Excellent. All right, so I'll start with an acknowledgement of country. So the Tasmanian Association for the Teaching of English acknowledges and pays its respects to the Pakana Palawa peoples of Lutruwita, their elders past, present and emerging, and recognises their enduring custodianship of the land on which we live and work, land that was never ceded. Further, Tate acknowledges and respects all First Nations people of Australia, working to support culture, language and sovereignty as voiced through the Uluru Statement from the I will now hand over to Daniel, who is going to introduce Cameron.
Thank you, Imogen. Proud to be president of Tate, and Tate that as an association is supportive of the Uluru Statement from the heart and in wishes with Aboriginal communities. I won't say any more on that matter right now. I would like to thank Cameron, who's been probably as much of a contributor to Tate over the last decade or so as anyone, been a member of the Tate Council for a number of years previously in the position of Northern Representative, has delivered professional learning in conferences and in weekend workshops on everything from poetry, creative writing, and on all sorts of things teaching. Currently at Launceston College. Cameron is a writer, poet, teacher. I was fortunate enough to see this session at the National Conference in Canberra earlier this year, and I'm really pleased that Cameron's agreed to present it for us now for people who aren't able to get there. So really aware that there's some people live with us now and some people who have registered to get an access to this recording later on. Particularly excited because, you know, as Tasmanians, we know we don't always get to see a whole lot of stories about ourselves and set in our home state and about the history of our home state and the people in our home state. So this is a chance to bring that into our classroom. And would be worth acknowledging here that Cameron has published a novel that shares many similarities with the documentary film of Franklin, and that's The Blue Cathedral, which was the novel that my book club chose to read when we met last month and discussed. So if you haven't stumbled across that yet, I encourage you to hunt a copy down. And I don't want to steal any more time off Cameron, so thank you very much, Cameron. All over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you, Imogen, and thank you, Layla, for your sparkling contributions. It's always a privilege for me to be able to talk about this film, Franklin. I don't know whether you have seen it. I will sort of be talking very broadly about what it's about and what happens, but mainly what I'm going to do today is, and for some reason my PowerPoint's not working now. Oh dear, what have I done wrong? Bear with me for a minute. Let that move on. It did before. Okay, I might just stop sharing for a minute. Hang on. Up here for some reason. That's weird. All right. Now, if I come back to, right, try this again. Sorry. Okay. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. And it's going to move on now. Right. So what I'm going to do over the next hour or so, or a bit longer, is walk you through the film a little bit. It's a very interesting film. One of the really interesting things about it is that it has several different major strands to it. It's not just a really important social history of Tasmania, and particularly the battle to save the Franklin River from environmental destruction. But it's also a very personal story about Oliver Cassidy, who is the main featured person in the film, and the journey that he undertakes rafting down the Franklin River to remember his father, who did the same journey in the early 1980s on his way to join the protest to stop the construction of the dam. I'll talk more about that in a little while. But specifically what I wanted to do was unpack the film, and the session that I've got this afternoon is slightly different to the one that I presented in Canberra. I've tweaked it a bit. And I hope that it's useful and will give you some ideas you can take into your classrooms. And what I want to do is look at 3 specific ways you might do that, 3 things you might focus on in terms of engaging students with this film, getting them to take meaning away from the film, how the film itself makes meaning, and so on. It's also worth exploring this film not only as a film to use in English classrooms, but as I said, it is a really rich source of relatively recent Tasmanian history. The period that it deals with is the early 1980s by and large, and also the modern day. And in the early 1980s, of course, there was a huge environmental campaign, as I said, to stop construction of the dam that would flood the Franklin River Valley. I'll provide some more details on that very, very soon, as I said. But so you can look at the film as a historical document, if you like. There's also lots of crossover with learning areas like geography, about how we interact with place in particular, and how we take meaning from the history of places and what they mean to us. And because of the nature of the protest that took place and some of the things that were done, I think there's also some quite valid engagement to be had with the legal studies area, particularly around protesters who were arrested and who refused bail. And because they refused bail, they were sent to Risdon Prison for a period of 7 days, to the point where Risdon Prison, in fact, became vastly overcrowded. There were so many of them arrested and things like that. So it's worth unpacking too, the legalities around that and some other things that the state government did at the time. So if we get time, we might touch on some of those things as well. The handout that I sent or had sent out with the link to this Zoom session has some generative questions on it. I've also got a very small number of those at the end of the presentation. So again, if we have time, we might unpack some of those. So just very quickly, I'm not entirely sure what age levels you deal with. I've sort of only focused on years 9 and 10 here, but I think there's also a good, there's lots of possibilities for sharing this film with year 8 students as well. One of the things that I'd love to spend a bit more time discussing, but I probably won't, is the fact that Oliver, who is in the film, is a transgender man. And he talks about that in the film and his journey to that realization and what it means for him. And so that is something that might spark some really interesting conversations in your classrooms around that aspect of the film as well. But I'm not so much focusing on that today. I'm more about the sort of strict English possibilities that there are, the learning opportunities and so on in this film. So I've basically gone through the Australian curriculum English there, and I've pulled out a couple of descriptors that I think are quite good. I'm not going to go through them. I'm sure you're probably more familiar with them than I am. I will highlight 1812 there, the social, moral and ethical positions represented in texts. This film is a really good one for unpacking some of those moral and ethical positions in response to the environment in particular, and in response to what we're prepared to do to protect the environment. And that, of course, has a lot of currency today with groups like Extinction Rebellion, who are fond of gluing themselves to roads and fences and machinery and chaining themselves to machinery and things like that. And lots of other protests around the world have seen activity like that as well. And to what extent is that a valid form of protest? And what are the conditions that have made actions like that necessary in the minds of those people? And that, of course, was also part of the big conversation that was taking place around the time of the Franklin Dam blockade as well. The right that people had to enter into someone else's workplace effectively and obstruct people going about their business, and all kinds of conversations there. The establishment of that workplace is also problematic, I should say, and I might get to that a bit later on when I talk about the details of what actually happened. So there are just some starting points, if you like, from the Australian curriculum. I work in the year 11 and 12 space, and this year I developed a unit based on Franklin to deliver to English Inquiry Level 2. There are, again, probably the most relevant learning outcomes from English Inquiry 2 that we worked on in unpacking this film and getting students to respond to it. And many of them did really well, actually, in sort of looking at both sides of the issue and determining how they could write persuasively, for one argument or the other, whether the dam should have gone ahead or whether it should have been stopped. and what that might mean. If it had gone ahead, what would that mean for Tasmania today, and so on. So there's all kinds of little teaching moments, teachable moments that the film comes with it that you can really unpack there. So my three main areas today that I'm going to focus on in terms of how you might engage with this in an English classroom, to do first of all with the idea of activism and what activism means. And I've sort of broken that down into four descriptors, as you can see there: causes, reactions, impacts, and consequences. And we're going to watch a YouTube clip from a TV show called Big Brother in about 2004, or a particular protest that happened related to that show, and I'll explain that in a minute. There's a beautiful poem called To the Anti-Dam Protesters in Risdon Prison by Vicky Raymond, and again, that was in the handout that was sent out yesterday with the link to this Zoom session. We're going to explore that and look at how that allows us to engage with some of the content in the film Franklin. And the third one is a much broader, more thematic idea about this whole concept of a journey. Now, in the film, Oliver, as I said, retraces his father's steps. His father, Mike, was a teacher and an activist, and he rafted down the Franklin and kept a diary while he did so. And in fact, extracts from his diary are read out in the film, and they're voiced over by the actor Hugo Weaving. And they provide a really interesting insight, which, of course, Oliver is recapturing as he looks at the same environment or the same locations through a slightly more contemporary lens. So there's a really interesting parallel of time going on there as well. So what I'm going to do now is, and I hope this works, I practiced it yesterday. Cross your fingers. We'll click on this here. This is about 1.5 minutes long, this YouTube clip. It's actually a sort of a news summary of what Merlin did. Just to explain it, sorry, but you're probably familiar with the concept of Big Brother, but in 2004, there was a housemate in the Big Brother house named Merlin. And every Sunday night, there would be a live television event where one of the housemates was evicted. And the night Merlin was evicted, he chose to use that opportunity to make quite a particular protest, as you'll see when we watch the clip.
Back at the Big Brother set today, controversial evictee Merlin Luck was unrepentant.
Yeah, free the refugees. Dude.
Last night, the 24-year-old refused to speak after he was evicted during a live broadcast, preferring a silent protest over refugees in detention.
Merlin, are you going to speak?
It was a deliberate action to create controversy, because controversy, sadly, is often the only way to create debate, to spark debate and discussion.
Merlin's stunt turned the tables on Big Brother. The reality TV producers admit they had no backup plan.
We have to, as producers, be clever to make sure that we are always in control of the show. And, like that, we maybe lost control for a couple of minutes.
I hope that even people who disagree with my point respect that I was being real, because this is reality television.
Refugee groups are applauding his decision.
We think what Merlin did was simply fantastic last night. It was very courageous by a young person to say what really needs to be said.
But the Minister for Immigration says Merlin is misguided.
He's obviously not very well informed. The sign that he was carrying said, free the refugees. There are no refugees in detention centres.
Merlin will have more to say on tonight's live nomination show. Katrina Zappa, 10 News.
Okay. So I'll just go back to my screen. All right, so on the next, hopefully this will, yep. So here's a little chart that I put together. This is called a chat chart, basically, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes now to have a break from the sound of my voice, if nothing else, and just have a look at how you might fill in each of those boxes in regard to what Merlin did. Now, just bearing in mind that he had a live national television audience for that protest. It's something that he didn't tell anyone he was doing it. He made the decision to do it and kept it to himself. So it was a complete surprise. You heard the producer there talk about how just for a couple of minutes during that broadcast, they lost control, which they did. I don't know whether I used to be able to show the actual footage of him doing it, and it's hosted by Gretel Colleen, and she clearly is struggling to try and keep things going while because obviously he's supposed to be interviewed, but he's taped his mouth up and he's holding up the sign and he's not going to say anything, which clearly makes the interview situation very, very difficult. So I'll give you a couple of minutes there just to reflect on each of those sort of aspects of what Merlin did and perhaps come up with some reactions. Okay, hopefully you can get a sense of how that activity would work in a classroom. It's a fairly good kind of introductory activity to generate some initial responses and to get some discussion going. Having discussions in class is one of the really good ways to fire up different views and to sort of get students not only perhaps presenting views, but having to explain them or even justify them. And that's a really valuable part of the process too, I think, in lots of ways. Did anyone want to share just quickly some of the things they thought about in response to that? Okay, we'll move on. Sorry.
I'll just say quickly, Cameron, I thought
Yep.
about like I remember that protest. I remember
Mm.
it feeling quite powerful at the time, and I just remember feeling lots of empathy because he was a really young kid, and he was like that short few seconds it showed him his legs just shaking from sitting there in silence.
Yeah.
I was just thinking of the nerves going through his body and the energy going through his body and everything. And I just recall from certain elements of society and certain parts of media, him, copping a lot of criticism and hatred for taking that stand and for not kind of playing along with, the entertainment format that show was, meant to be.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm not address specifically which box that would go in, but I like the connections you can make with that protest and
absolutely
as well.
Yeah, and what I liked about it also, and the way that it connects with the Franklin stuff that we'll get to soon, is that it's kind of a passive form of protest. He's not doing anything explicit. He's not putting himself in anyone's way. He's just sitting there and being silent. And it must have taken a reasonable, quite a vast amount of courage for him to do that, knowing that he is expected to talk and be interviewed and be, part of and play the game, if you like. And clearly he chose to use that platform that he had, with, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people watching live, to not play that game and to actually make quite a strong statement. I was also drawn by what he said about controversy being often the only way you're able to get these points across. And so being controversial is often what's required. I think there's a fair element of that in probably most protests. And as I said before, people who, members of Extinction Rebellion and so on, who chain themselves to bulldozers or glue themselves to works of art in the Louvre in Paris, that's exactly what they're doing. They're sparking controversy, but in quite a provocative way. But that's how they're getting their point across. So people are listening to the message, if you like. Perhaps not in the way that they always intended, but they're certainly hearing the message at least. And that's how they've chosen to do that. Before I move on, did anyone else have anything they wanted to contribute, just quickly? Okay, so what I wanted to do now was show you the first 6 minutes or so of the film. Now, in order to do that, I tried to, it's available in ClickView if you weren't aware, so you can watch the whole thing, and that's how you can share it with your class if you choose to do so. But I tried to create a clip for this, and for some reason it wouldn't let me do it, and I couldn't figure out why. So once again, I'll have to stop sharing just briefly, and I'll bring up this bit here. No, that's not it. There it is. There. And if I go back to screen sharing again, hopefully it will work. Okay, so you can see that. Can you? Yep. Okay, so here we go.
Taken me 7 years to get here, to the epic country you fought to save. I can hear the river far below, just a trickle. Sounds tame, but I know it's wild. There's a part of me that's afraid. It wants to stay up here where it's safe and dry. But as you always said, there's no turning back on the Franklin. Only one way home. Rally in the country's history.
And the Franklin has caused bitter and divisive protests that have drawn world attention to the region.
Tasmania's hydroelectric commission dominated an era of hydro-industrialisation.
The hydro had built dams on every major river in Tasmania, except for Franklin. And now it wanted one there too.
Ecologically, it's very important for our survival that parts of the earth are left undisturbed.
This is part of life, isn't it? If we're going to live as human beings, we've got to order things. Economics of this game have been proven, but who can put a value to the world's last remaining natural areas?
The United Nations have put Southwest Tasmania on the World Heritage List.
We've made up our mind we're going to get on with the job.
In the summer of 1983, my dad embarked on a 14-day journey, paddling the wild Franklin River. He knew that this might be his last opportunity to experience the river untouched.
Millions of Australians, including Tasmanians, want to stop the dam and stop it now before there's any more destruction.
Dad had never broken the law before, never tempted time in prison, but this trip would change all that. I was born only days after my dad's return, and somehow the Franklin River exists in myth for me now. Almost 40 years ago, my father was one of the protesters who took part in the fight to keep the wild Franklin River flowing free to the sea. At the height of the campaign, he embarked on a 14-day epic journey to support the cause. Something Dad said that stayed with me. was being out there in the wilderness, detaching from city experience. That's where life really happens. I don't know how you would be more close than Dad and I were. He was very calm and thoughtful kind of person, and would like, it just sort of make you feel safe, I guess. Dad imbued a respect and love of nature into me right from the beginning. Spending time with Dad out in the bush, you absorb it. It kind of becomes part of you. If I would ask anything of him, he would always turn it into a teaching moment. You know, he was a school teacher, so I guess that holds up. He was an adventurer. He would totally plan out to the nth degree so that he could push himself to the next degree after that. He had some epic stories that I grew up listening to about getting out in the bush, multi-day hikes and rafting trips and skiing trips and you name it. On all of Dad's adventures, he would keep a diary, mostly perfunctory notes. The one that did have the most detail was about the Franklin River.
Our expectations are for a 14-day epic. Rain, snow, floods, violent water, at the end of which I'll hopefully see the Lee Tree and join the blockade.
Dad was so fit and healthy and capable. It was a real shock when he was diagnosed with bile duct cancer. He watched me watching him get sicker and sicker. And he'd be sitting up in a hospital bed asking, what are you learning from all this? And at the same time, from that hospital bed, looking out the window at the mountains, talking about the next adventure. Just before Dad died, he gave me his paddle, definitely handing down a challenge.
I'll leave that there for now. So I'll bring my PowerPoint back up. So I'll just spend a few minutes now, and you can see there that's how the film basically is set up. Before I move on, so Oliver and his father were very, very close, and his father sadly passed away in about 2016, I think, or thereabouts. And so part of the journey that Oliver goes on in the film is to reconnect with his father and remember him and mourn him, and so it's quite a beautiful personal journey as much as it is a significant environmental journey. So I just wanted to orient us to where we are basically in Tasmania. I don't know whether you've been down the west coast, but the Franklin River rises not all that far from Derwent Bridge, as you can see on the top right-hand corner of the map there. It travels for about 129 kilometres, heading broadly southwest, and eventually it flows into the Gordon River, which in turn flows into Macquarie Harbour, as you can see there. And the protest action mostly occurred around here. You can see where the arrow is. So quite a long way upriver. That's where a lot of the hydro construction was happening. And it's also where the river protest actions took place. So the blockaders had a camp upriver, so did the police, by the way. And my personal connection to this story, by the way, is that my father was in Tasmania Police at the time, and he was specifically part of the contingent that went to the west coast during this time with the water police. So he was on the boats, and when people were arrested and they had enough for a boat trip back to Strahan, he would ferry them all the way up that river and across Macquarie Harbour back to Strahan, and then go back and basically do it again. And he did that probably 2 or 3 times a day for 4 or 5 months. as long as action was taking place. So that's the area of Tasmania that we're looking at, and it's worth possibly just having a quick look at. I'm just going to minimise that for a bit if I could. It's worth having just a quick look at the context here. So this is the background of what took place. What I haven't included there is that in the early 1970s, the Tasmanian government, through the Hydroelectric Commission, approved the flooding of Lake Pedder. Lake Pedder was a unique inland perched lake in southwest Tasmania, and it was submerged under what they call an impoundment, which is the body of water created when a dam is constructed and the water backs up behind it. And the loss of Lake Pedder is what actually triggered a lot of the environmental action that followed. And certainly the campaign to save the Franklin directly flowed on from the loss of Lake Pedder, so there is a connection there. But the Gordon Dam and the proposed Gordon below Franklin Dam were only the kind of tail end of a very, very long process of dam building in Tasmania, which had been taking place for most of the 20th century. In fact, it started in the 1920s. It had a bit of a boom after World War II because there was quite a significant degree of post-war European migration to Tasmania, and many of those migrants worked on dam construction projects, such as the Trevellyn Dam, which is about 2 minutes down the road from where I'm sitting here in Launceston, but also up through the central Midlands of Tasmania in places like Waiatina and Tarraleah and so on. So the West Coast phase in the 70s and the proposed ones for the 80s. And I should also point out, by the way, that even though the Franklin Dam itself was stopped, there are at least two others that were built after it. One of them created Lake Burpee behind Queenstown, and the other one created Lake Plimsoll, which is about halfway between Queenstown and Rosebery. They both were constructed after the Franklin Dam was rejected, or after construction stopped. So the Franklin Dam blockade didn't stop dam construction. It simply stopped, of course, the one that would have flooded the Franklin River Valley. But I digress. So people were aware that in order to stop this environmental destruction, they would have to take action. And you may have seen him in the film that I played earlier. Dr. Bob Brown was the one who stepped up to decide he would coordinate resources as far as that went. He formed the Tasmanian Wilderness Society in 1976, where 16 people met at his home, greenies in beanies, he calls them in the film. And the Wilderness Society, of course, is still going today. And indeed, there's also a very clear sort of understanding that the environmental actions that saved the dam also led to the establishment of the Greens as a political party in Tasmania, and later on nationally here in Australia. So the plans for southwest Tasmania for the Gordon below Franklin Dam first saw the light of day in about 1976, and that's when Bob Brown decided to form the Wilderness Society. For the next 5 years, there was quite a bit of controversy. You saw footage in the film of marches in Hobart against the dam proposal. At the time, Tasmania had a Labor Premier, a man by the name of Doug Lowe, and he tried to offer a compromise position, an alternative hydro scheme. But the HEC weren't having any of that. They had their sort of minds, if you like, set on the one they wanted to build. So as a result of his attempts to defuse the situation, Doug Lowe was replaced as Premier by Harry Holgate, who lasted, I think, about 5 months in the job before he went to a state election. And that state election in 1982 was resoundingly won by the Liberal Party. And our new Premier at that time was a man named Robin Gray, who features quite a bit in the film. And there's footage of him uttering his famous description of the Franklin River as a brown, leech-ridden ditch, which I'll come back to a little bit later on. So the blockade, so they decided that lots of protests, lots of political engagement and so on with politicians trying to stop this, and none of it was really working. Robin Gray was adamant that it would go ahead, and so they decided the only way to take action was to actually go to the West Coast and blockade the area with people. And so all in all, between December 1982 and the end of March 1983, About 2,500 people made their way to the west coast, and they did things like you see the group in the photo doing there. That's a hydro road leading into one of the construction sites, and of course they are blocking it, preventing trucks and equipment and so on getting through. And as I said to you earlier, this kind of passive form of protest was really quite successful. They're not doing anything. They're not being aggressive. They're simply putting themselves in the way, which is enough to stop progress. And indeed, anyone who signed up to take part in such action had to complete non-violent action training. So they'd be trained in methods and ideas and strategies, and they do lots of role plays and so on to problem solve and sort out how to actually take part successfully in actions like this, specifically to prevent them becoming violent confrontations. So this blockade lasted, as I said, until March 1983. By then, the campaign to stop the dam had become a huge national issue. Some very famous images came out of the southwest wilderness, such as Peter Dombrovskis' image, Rock Island Bend. So people could see for themselves perhaps what was potentially going to be lost if the dam had gone ahead. And Bob Hawke contested the 83 federal election on the back of a clear commitment to intervene and stop the dam project, which he did, because of course Bob Hawke won the 83 federal election. At about the same time, the area was granted World Heritage listing, and Hawke, passed legislation to prevent work on the dam, which the government ignored, which left Hawke with no choice but to take the issue to the High Court. The High Court ruled on July the 1st, 1983, that the federal government had the right to override the Tasmanian state government on this issue and on environmental issues. It's interesting that it was a split ruling. It wasn't a definitive one way or the other. It was 4-3, so it only took one judge to sort of go the other way and it would have been lost. People often forget just how close it was, but nonetheless, the decision came down in favour of the environment, and at that point, construction of the dam stopped. So what I'm going to do now is just give you, again, a bit of a break from the sound of my voice. This is a very similar chart to the one you just saw with Merlin and Merlin's protest, but now we're going to apply some of the similar thinking, if you like, to what the protesters on the West Coast in 1982, 1983 did, and what kind of consequences and so on grew from that. So I'll leave you alone for a minute or two to have a think. And if you want to jot things down again, of course, please feel free to do so. Okay, how did we go with that? I mean, again, it's just an opportunity for you to have a think about how the the protest actions that you kind of saw briefly on the film and in the photos that I showed you, how they achieved a result. People are looking for a couple of results, as I said. They're looking to prevent work going ahead, but they're also looking to get their name out there. And there's a couple of bits in the film where they talk about, quite often when there were going to be a large number of arrests on the river during a particular action, they made sure that they would time those arrests to happen when the media crews turned up so they could film them. And that's how word got out of what was happening. So there's quite a bit of strategy involved in some of this as well. And as I said, Bob Brown was very clever in making use of things like photography, visual images, to tell people just how beautiful the area was, and how that kind of reinforced the drama around what would be lost if the dam had gone ahead, and so on. Did anyone just quickly want to share what they've come up with or what they thought about?
It just got me thinking about like the impact and in terms of like the long-term impact or consequences, and that how what happened there has kind of paved the way for future proposals being, I guess, rejected.
Sure. The other point to make, of course, is that this isn't the last time there's been a significant environmental action in Tasmania.
No.
And I often talk about the fact that we have this odd conversation that goes on over and over again here between development and the environment, and between the economy and preserving our, quite beautiful, in many cases, quite beautiful natural heritage. And in the film, you'll hear, if you listen carefully, you'll hear people who work for the hydro talk about how, we have to learn to shape the environment to suit us if we're going to survive here and things like that, which is quite a capitalist attitude, of course. And I think there are elements of the state government that may well still feel like that. That if a tree grows, it grows to be cut down and turned into timber for housing or whatever. Which is disappointing. I mean, I was involved also in the campaign to stop the guns pulp mill in the Tamar Valley, and there have been lots of other protests. Bob Brown, of course, has repeatedly joined in with logging protests, and he's currently very actively involved, of course, in the campaign to try and save the swift parrot from extinction in the, I think, in the Wellangta area, south of Triabunna, in sort of the native forest down there. So there's always something happening. There's always something that we have to be really vigilant about. And what the Franklin Dam protest does, I think, really is that it reminds us that it can work, it can be successful, because it always seems like it may not. People aren't listening, that it's not going anywhere. But in fact, it did on that occasion, and it was quite a result. Any other input before we move on? What I might just, before going on to the next slide, just quickly, the other thing you can have a really interesting discussion about in classes is not so much about protesting necessarily or activism, although activism is part of it, but just the process of making change. So if you see something that you want to fix, or you see something that you think is wrong, or and it may be as simple as wanting to change an item of your school uniform, or wanting to get playground equipment, or the playground equipment that's there is old and a bit dangerous, or it's not much fun anymore, it doesn't move very smoothly, or whatever it happens to be. How do you go about that? How do you make that change happen? What can you do in terms of getting results and making a case, doing some research, writing letters, all that kind of stuff? It's all part of the same process in lots of ways. What we see with the Franklin Dam situation is a very sort of blown up version of that, but it can also happen individually at community level, and even just around schools and things like that. And I'd like to think that students always have the opportunity to tap into that process if they decide that something needs fixing, or they want to make change. There are ways to do that are legitimate, that are successful, that are valid, and that can actually generate a reasonable outcome. might take a bit of work, but it's hopefully worth it in the end. Okay, if there's no further comments, we might move on. That's okay. And we're going to do this thing again, are we? Where my PowerPoint is stuck. Okay, bear with me for a tick. We're down to, no, we won't. We were down to here. All right, so we'll go from the current slide. All right, so we'll move on from there. All right, so we're going to, so that was activism, if you like, or a very brief look at it. And one of the things I like about that as a concept is that, as I just said, it's available to pretty much anyone. You don't need a lot of resources. Being able to write a good letter might be really effective. Gathering some data or some research to support your case could be really effective, but by and large, these things are available to everyone. So I'm going to move on now and talk about the poem. And the poem that I have come across is To the Anti-Dam Protesters in Risdon Prison. I thought I'd read it to you, just because it's good to hear poetry aloud. And I've got some sort of talking points there that I might, I can, whether I can, oh, there we go, sorry. I'll just, so I can read the whole thing. Okay, so this is To the Anti-Dam Protesters at Risdon Prison by Vicky Raymond. Never before has the prison held such prisoners as these. Shall I tell you their crimes? First, they conspired willfully to keep the peace with nature. Second, they sought to preserve life with malice aforethought. Third, they plotted the destruction of our right to destroy. What can be said in their defence? Perhaps they were not taught that the earth is our quarry. Perhaps they were misled by the grumbling of rivers, those well-known subversives. Perhaps their mothers failed to wean their tastes, as was proper, from water to cement. Yes, it must have been the mother's fault, and our men shall hunt down any day the ringleader of the mothers, that old one with her apron full of rivers, and make her pay, and make her pay. It's a really powerful poem, and I've got a series of questions there underneath it. This is in the document that was emailed yesterday, and I notice that Imogen has in fact shared a link to it in the chat as well, if you didn't get it with the email or you want another copy. We're not going to go through those questions that I've got there now, but I really like the way that poem takes quite an ironic view of the people who were arrested and you know, what constitutes a crime, perhaps. And again, that is another talking point that you can bring into your classrooms in getting students to think about different perceptions, but also how irony works itself, I suppose, as a poetic device in this case. But in addition to that particular poem, there are some other spots during the film, and if you haven't seen it, I'll just sort of describe these moments to you quickly. And I remember this, in fact, at the time, the discovery of the Kudakina Cave, which is a very, very important Indigenous site on the Franklin River. And Oliver, of course, is paddling down the river, and he comes to the spot where Kudakina Cave is, and he makes his way to the entrance, but he decides not to go in, and that's for culturally sensitive reasons. He doesn't feel like he's been invited in or being invited in. And so he moves on, but he has a moment there where he thinks about that and what it means. And I should, by the way, generally mention that the film has a really lovely connection with First Nations mythology. There's a sequence at the beginning where he talks about, according to Palawa mythology, how the Franklin River was formed, which is a really nice moment. And he also, well, actually two of the people that he interviews or who are interviewed in the film, Jimmy Everett, the well-known Aboriginal activist here in Tasmania, and also Auntie Patsy Cameron, who's a venerable Aboriginal elder and has done a lot of work herself on educating people about Tasmanian Aboriginal culture and so on. So there's a very, very strong presence in the film of First Nations ideas and thinking around that part of the world and what it means. And of course, their thinking also was that it must be preserved, it must be protected, because obviously their connection to that area goes back many, many, many thousands of years. So Oliver chooses not to go into the cave, and you can perhaps think about the process he goes through to make that choice, and how you might capture that in a poem. There's a very confronting scene in the film where the HEC bring a bulldozer down the river on a barge, and they actually show the bulldozer being driven ashore at the area on the map where I showed you earlier. And the bulldozer starts doing what a bulldozer does. It destroys trees and starts cutting a path through the otherwise pristine bush in that area. And many of the protesters are just in tears at this. They're very upset. Clearly, I mean, as powerful as they are as a collective, there's no way they can stop a barge with a bulldozer on it from getting through. Many of them talk about how the person steering the barge or towing the barge broke quite a few maritime laws. But that's perhaps an argument for another time. But that's quite an effective and powerful and affecting, I should say, moment in the film. The other interesting element of the film is that lovely description by Robin Gray of the river as he says, for many parts of the year, the Franklin's nothing more than a brown leech-ridden ditch. And there are shots, and many, many dozens of shots in the film of the river being anything but, I should say. So again, it's what he's doing, what Robin Gray is doing there is using language really for a very clear political purpose. Politicians want to devalue something that they want to take away or that they don't think is worth, continuing with, perhaps. And certainly he couldn't see that the protesters had any real argument for the dam to be stopped. And one of the ways he sought to make that argument was to devalue what they were trying to save, which is the river. So by casting it in particularly ugly and quite confronting language as he does there, is one of the ways he did that. So, but again, thinking about the different perspective might be a way for students to come at different ways of thinking about this issue and thinking about the environment. And again, some people take a very different attitude to the environment based on what they can take from it rather than what it can give them, perhaps. I've also got a note there about the potential to play with forms. There are lots and lots of lovely moments in this film that could make, for example, some really beautiful haiku poetry. Haiku is the Japanese minimalist form, 3 lines or thereabouts. And they are generally intended to unpack a specific moment, but give that moment quite resonant metaphorical depth. And I think there's lots of opportunities in the film with different things that you see, where a haiku would work really well in terms of unpacking some of that stuff. There's another moment, by the way, which is towards the end. So in the film, you see the outcome of the High Court to stop the dam, and you see the reaction to that in Queenstown, which is quite aggressive, I must say. There's a lovely shot of a local saying, "Oh, I reckon there'll be a murder in town tonight." And the hydro workers who were down there, of course, were also pretty filthy that their work had been taken away, or at least that particular project had been taken away. You heard Mike Cassidy talk about how he would hope to end up at the end of his journey by being able to see the Lee tree. The Lee tree was famous. It's a very, very old human pine tree. There's a scene in the film where Bob Brown takes people in to see it, and they stand around it. It's quite an amazing thing. Well, a group of hydro workers walked into the Lee tree when the decision was made by the High Court, and they effectively poisoned it. They cut holes in the trunk and they poured in diesel. I think they tried to set it alight, but that didn't work very well. But the diesel was enough to poison the tree, and so it died off for quite a while. Apparently, it is starting to come back now, and there is some new growth in the very, very high sections of it. But effectively, the tree was killed. And that was purely an act of spite by these workers who wanted to make a statement about what impact the protesters' decisions had on their livelihoods, perhaps. And that, of course, is always the argument that, if you interfere with or if you protest about these developments, then you are potentially interfering with people's livelihoods and their earning a living and so on. But as I said, even though the Franklin Dam itself was stopped, the hydro went on to successfully construct at least two other dams in the region. So the project's continued, just that particular project was stopped. So poetry is a really good way to engage with some of these issues, as I said, and it gives students a chance to engage creatively, but also to explore some of those different perspectives, and perhaps to write a poem as a conversation, to write a poem as a testament to a particular place. There's all kinds of opportunities, as I'm sure many of you know, to take your students for a walk around the school, or if you have a park nearby, that's another really good opportunity, and just to open them up to noises, to shadows, to colours, to sensations, and how that can feed into a lot of that poetry as well. And if you stop the film, if you're watching Franklin, you stop it at different times, you're able to really get a sense of how the area looks and how beautiful and serene it is. And that could also be some really nice sort of ways into responding to that place poetically. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to, this is the third of the three, we're almost there. I wanted to sort of suggest that Franklin contains both a literal and a metaphorical journey. Now, the literal journey, of course, is fairly straightforward. It's a young man who decides to raft down a river to remember his father, and when his father did the same thing, where are we, 50 years ago or thereabouts, 40 years ago, 40 years ago, sorry, to take part in this protest action. So that's, the literal part of it. So you then get to think about, well, what is the metaphorical aspect of this journey, and what is Oliver actually doing? There's a couple of elements to that, I think. One is connecting with his father, even though his father is no longer alive. And the other one is really becoming immersed in his sense of self. As I said before, Oliver goes on a quite interesting gender journey as part of this film. He's a transgender man. And one of the interesting things is that his father never knew him that way. So he transitioned after his father died. And so he comes to terms with, knowing that his father would have been proud of him because he's acted with integrity and wanting to live, genuinely and fully as he wants to, rather than the body that he was born into, and so on. So that's another really interesting aspect of the film. But stepping back from that and just looking at the more kind of literary aspects of a journey, if you think about the component parts of what a journey might be, clearly you have a starting point, you have some hazards or some obstacles, you have an account of the natural world through which a character or characters are either navigating their way or are being navigated. And then you have an end point, of course, and by the end of the journey, the characters won't be the same people who set out at the beginning. And it might be worth thinking in this film how Oliver is different at the end of the film. He's different as a person, different as a son, to what he's like at the beginning of the film. And it's also worth thinking about, of course, the journey as, again, a reminder that saving this river was really quite beneficial. I mean, it's quite confronting to think about what could have been lost and what the west coast of Tasmania would be like today had the dam gone ahead. And so, again, you can invite those discussions, but you can also get students to explore, either through their writing or through their own research, how that might have impacted how we view the environment today if the dam had gone ahead, or how a film like this one allows you to really immerse yourself in the place and why the place is important. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, so these are some generative questions. These are a very small handful from the ones that are on the list. There's 13 or so of them on the list. I just highlighted some here. I'm quite happy to go through these and just sort of very briefly discuss them. And again, these could be starting points. Obviously, a good generative question is something that will drive lots of different points of view, and hopefully in your classrooms you're encouraging students to speak up without judgment and without fear, because that is what a good conversation is. It should take place without restrictions, without people being afraid to speak up because either they'll be laughed at or they'll be told they're wrong, or none of that really matters. Oh, sorry, I got out of that. So I've talked about these bail conditions before, and one of the things you might think about is whether or not government should have the right to do that. In addition to that, I mentioned also, by the way, that the state government, when this proposal was initially developed in the late 1970s, the state government vested huge amounts of land in southwest Tasmania in the Hydroelectric Commission. So effectively what that means is they handed it over to them and it became hydro property. And that is why a lot of the all of the protesters who were arrested were charged with trespass, because they were on hydro property, even though it's Southwest Wilderness. The government had said that property now belongs to the hydro, so they can build their dam there. It's going to become a work site, and that's why the protests, that's why the arrests were possible, because the protesters who willfully stayed on that property were trespassing. So that's one thing that happened, if you like. The government also, as things continued, as the blockade continued over several months, and as I said, Brisbane Prison filled up very quickly. In fact, it overflowed at one point. There were protesters sleeping on mattresses in corridors and things like that. The state government introduced what's called the Wild West bail condition, and what that was, I should say, is that if when you're arrested, if you agreed to leave the West Coast and not come back, I think west of the King River was the dividing line, then you were free to go and everything would be forgotten. But of course, a lot of protesters couldn't make that guarantee, because they were willing to come back as long as they had to in order to see the campaign through, to see the blockade through. So, but again, a state government sort of imposing those restrictions on its citizens is an interesting thing to think about, and whether or not you see it as the state government becoming increasingly desperate to try and minimise the number of people who were on the West Coast engaging in protests. Who knows? It didn't really work, though, as I said, because people who were committed to the action were committed to it, and they were going to do whatever it took to return as often as they needed to. So they'd go and do their few days in Risdon, and then they'd come out and go straight back to the West Coast and probably get arrested again. There was something like, I can't remember the exact number, but there was something like 1,250 people arrested over the three and a half months of the blockade. Many of those were arrested 3 or 4 or 5 times, or even more. The youngest person arrested, in fact, was the late Deputy Mayor of Launceston, Jeremy Ball. He was 12, I think, and he was arrested with his parents, John and Caroline. And the oldest was in his 90s, I think. So people came from all walks of life too, of course. I should probably mention that. Anyway, I'm getting off the track here. So one of the things you can debate in your classes is whether or not government should have the right to do that. Now, again, what are those governments doing? They're protecting workers' rights up to a point. They're committing themselves to a policy. For a government to sort of have a policy and then backtrack on it if people decide they don't like it is probably not very good, political management. So they have to back themselves, and so on. It is interesting to think about why the campaign to save the river was successful. And if you have any comments to that effect, I'm more than happy for you to discuss them. We can have a chat about that. But it worked mainly because it was very much a grassroots campaign. Anyone could be involved. And it also managed to spread quite a long way beyond Tasmania, which is really important. So it became a national campaign. There was not a referendum, but a vote, I think, in the early 1980s to ascertain national support for the project. And a lot of people voted informally, just wrote no dams on their ballot paper. and things like that. And so people were really behind the principle of the campaign. They were behind the objectives of the campaign, and that's partly why it worked. And it also, of course, you can't underestimate the energy and the commitment of people like Bob Brown, who were absolutely tireless and who are still tireless in their campaigns to try and preserve the environment. I might leave that there for now. You get the idea about how these questions can, of course, be unpacked quite extensively in classrooms. I sort of go back to that idea I was talking about before there with that last one about if you needed to affect change in your local area, how would you go about it? What would be effective? What do you think wouldn't work? What wouldn't you do? And you can think about things like that as well. Finally, I think, yes, so that brings me to this book on your screen now, Death of a River Guide. If you want some really lovely intertextuality, I recommend this book. It's Richard Flanagan's first novel. It's not a challenging read, but it's quite long. And it basically, what happens is there's a river guide, of course. He slips out of his boat on the very first page and he is drowning in the river, and the entire novel unfolds in the amount of time that it takes this tour guide. His name is Aljaz Kosini, and the amount of time it takes him to drown. So there's lots of flashbacks and memory and history incorporated into what happens, and it's a beautifully written book, and it's something else that, in fact, I remember when I first read it quite a long time ago now. And it was the first time I'd come across a story that was set in Tasmania, written by a Tasmanian, and that was beautifully written and quite compelling to read. And you know, I could resonate with the stories that were told. I could resonate with the history. I could resonate with the locations and the environment that he was talking about. Pardon me. And I would hope that a lot of people who come to Franklin now might have the same feeling. They can see the place where they live up on screen. They can see what was done to try and save a significant chunk of that place. And they can also see how a young man going on a journey down a river on his own is quite a compelling story in terms of that man connecting with his own father and finding his own place in the world and what that looks like. That's pretty much all I have, ladies and gentlemen. I'm more than happy now to answer questions. I might stop that. So if you have anything you'd like to ask, I don't know whether there's anything in the chat. Doesn't look like there is.
I'm interested, Cameron. I'll just jump in first and see if anyone wants anything. Thank you, first of all, for your presentation. I'm interested in how students have responded to some of the activities you might have run with them, or that your colleagues might have run with them, particularly about, I guess I'm just being curious here, what's the level of existing knowledge that there might be amongst the classes about, you know, the protests and the blockade and the damming? And also the second part of the question would be about how you find students have responded, I guess, to the central character, to Oliver as the central character in the film.
In terms of student existing knowledge, no, there's not a lot, to be honest. It really hasn't been. It's not something I suppose, or that people have continued to talk about. It just kind of happened, and then we moved on, I guess. And so there hasn't been this kind of continual conversation about it over the last 40 odd years. I know one of the reasons why Oliver was really keen to get this film up, and he's driven the film. He had the idea, he sought the funding, he did the crowdfunding. You may have seen on the bit that I showed you, the film was supported in part by 791 crowdfunding sources. And in fact, full disclosure, I was one of those. He wanted to introduce the whole story, the whole Franklin story, to the next generation, basically, and was very keen to do that. And because there hadn't really been a lot of, as I said, there hasn't been a lot of ongoing discussion of it, or there's occasionally things in the media when there's an anniversary, or. But the other interesting thing, though, is that in those parts of Tasmania, in Queenstown and Strahan, there's still quite a lot of division and quite a lot of angst about it. And there may well even be families who still aren't talking to each other as a result. That was very much the case at the time, and it's kind of been sustained. And people who provided support to the greenies, as they were called, through their businesses, those businesses were ostracised or vandalised, or there's quite a lot of that going on. But in terms of how they've responded, the students that I had this year that I did the unit that I was talking about with, which involved quite a bit of work on how the film was persuasive, but also whether they detect any bias in the film. I haven't really talked about that, but the film is, pro-environment, and quite unashamedly so. There are some sources in the film who make the other case, but they're kind of marginalised a bit. And it's interesting how students pick that up. You don't really even have to mention it. You just hear them say, well, where are the people who wanted the dam to be built, and what do they have to say, and so on and so on. So they're quite perceptive that way, and some of the writing they've done in response has been really beautiful. Like they've really picked up on Oliver as a good storyteller, as someone who's been able to, someone they can engage with. I suppose because he's reasonably close to their age, they can probably relate to him for that reason. Although he's 30 now, I think, but he still comes across as quite young, I suppose. And so it's been really good. I'm hoping to teach the same unit again next year, and I'll make a few changes, and I'll see whether that kind of engagement is continuing. Any other
questions? Barbara's put something in the chat, Cameron, because Barbara's been reading your novel, The Blue Cathedral, and it's just been taken by the word behemoth. For some reason, your use of that word in the novel. So I've noticed Barbara's got a comment about that in the chat.
That's a very, very good question, Barbara. I honestly can't even remember 100% where I used the word in my novel. It's a while since I've looked at it, which is embarrassing, I know. But look, it's just it's a word that means big, and very, very big. And yeah, it's a good word to use. It's a word that feels nice in the mouth, as they say. Behemoth.
Yes, Cameron, it's Barbara.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Wow, I just loved it. I loved that word. I thought it was just brilliant. And I thought, vocabulary expansion. I teach migrants, and it's always about pronunciation. So this word just appealed to me. And then I happened to be looking up rock bands, and apparently the metal band Behemoth is performing in Melbourne on the 1st to the 3rd of December.
There you go. Small
And
world.
then it's mentioned in the Old Testament. It's a powerful grass-eating animal whose bones and tubes of bronze, and his limbs are like bars of iron. That's in Job. And then, then Cameron, then it's something that is extremely large and often extremely powerful. Yeah, so Cameron, I just loved it. I thought, wow, what a word.
What a word. Thank you, Barbara. Anybody else?
Fantastic name for a metal band. I'll agree with that. Cameron, I hope if anyone to jump in if they've got any questions, but I'm wondering if you wanted to give a 1-minute summary of your novel, The Blue Cathedral, and kind of what approach you take to the story in that novel, or where it came from. Would you mind doing that?
I wish I had a copy to hold up.
I went to bring one to work today. I don't know if it's on my dining table.
So it actually was first published in 2012 by 40 South, the fabulous 40 South Books, who produced the magazine and also have a very, very long publishing list now of Tasmanian novels and short stories and what have you. And I lived in Queenstown for 3 or 4 years in the 80s. I got there in 1984, so the dam issue was over by then. But as I said, there was some sort of festering sentiment, I suppose, in society. And as I said, my father was a policeman, so he was actually the inspector in Queenstown, which tarred me a little bit as well. But it was a bizarre place to live, I have to say. It was still at the time when all the hills around the town were bare. There were no trees. All the trees had been chopped down to feed the mine, the smelters in the mine, to drive the furnaces and so on back in the day. And because Queenstown, as many people probably know, it gets lots of rainfall. When they chop down the trees, and in the heavy rainfall, the topsoil was washed away, and so trees couldn't reseed or replant themselves. That situation is changing now, and there's quite a bit of growth down there. But back in the mid 80s, it was barren. It was called the lunar landscape, and it would rain and snow and be very, very cold in winter, and it would be scorching hot in summer because the sun just reflects off all these bare hills. So I remember that very clearly and had some memories there. And I was going to try and write a sort of weird memoir type thing that was based on some of the different places I've lived in Tasmania. And I wrote a short story called Breaking In, which I sent to Island Magazine. And David Owen, who was then publisher, published it and said there was something in it. And the main character, who turned into Billy Anson in the Blue Cathedral, was quite interesting. So he said, you should write some more of this. So I did, and then I cottoned on to the idea of connecting it to the Franklin Dam. So the Blue Cathedral is effectively two stories. It's the story of Billy, who lives in Queenstown, who's a young delinquent and a bit of a tearaway, and his father is dying of cancer. And the other young character is Chris, who decides to throw everything in and join the blockade, the protest action. So he hitchhikes from Hobart to do that, and their paths kind of cross, and it's kind of a coming-of-age story in some ways, I suppose. But yeah, and I wondered whether 40 South would bring it out again this year to coincide with the 40th anniversary, and they said they were happy to. So I've had the opportunity to revisit it and fix up a few things and correct a few things, and it's out again now. So there are copies in Fuller's. I was in Hobart on Saturday, in fact, and there are 3 copies on the shelf there that I signed, so you can grab yourself a signed copy if you want. And there are also copies up here at Petrarch's in Launceston and in Burnie and in Queenstown at the Missing Tiger Bookshop down there. So, yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity for a shameless plug. It's not really why I'm here, but anyway. Any final questions or thoughts? Okay, so Courtney's gone. That's all right.
And resources in conjunction with the film available online, Cameron?
Yeah, so what I should stress is that there's an educational website with the film. If you search Franklin, I forget what it is, it's Franklin Resources or Franklin Education, you'll come up with the website where you can buy the film, you can buy the DVD, you can also buy some merchandise if you want, some No Dams merchandise. But there's quite an extensive list now of resources across things like geography and English and history and outdoor education and lots of other kind of areas like that. So they're all compiled on their website. What I might do is find the link to that and send it to you, so you can copy it to people who've either get the recording or who are here today, because it is a really good resource to look at in terms of, again, depending on which learning area you want to be in, or whether you need to adapt something for a different grade or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I'm old school. I know it's on ClickView, but I've gone and purchased the DVD for myself as well. So
yeah, good. Yeah,
tangible. You can hold it. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think on the DVD there's an interview with Oliver and Bob Brown as well. That's really quite good. So just to give you some more information. Yeah.
If no one has more questions, I just wanted to say that watching that again, I just regret not actually going to the cinema to see Franklin, because of just how beautiful some of those shots are, and what a well-made film it is. Also for me, this has been like a bit of a history lesson, knowing a bit about the Franklin blockade, but not as much as I feel I should have. I should know as a Tasmanian, and also a bit of frustration at the moment. I'm not teaching English, so I can't apply any of these ideas that you're sharing. But for those of us in the room today and those who will view this recording later, I just want to say thank you, Cameron, for sharing your wealth of knowledge, your passion and interest for this subject matter, and obviously of your creative and clever teaching ideas. And what always comes through with you, Cameron, is that your desire to share knowledge, expertise, and to collaborate with your colleagues inside the English teaching profession, and we always appreciate it. So thank you very much on behalf of Tate.
Thank you. My absolute pleasure. And I hope you find something you can use in the classroom today or from the film or some of the other resources. It's really worth checking out. So thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.
Cheerio.